And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, and ended up with thousands of Americans across the country wearing overalls as part of the boycott. I feel like the topic of boycotts has been coming up an increasing amount lately. And of course, the idea of a group of people refusing to interact commercially with an entity because they disagree with it is not a novel one, think Boston Tea Party, but the term itself is not actually terribly old. The word boycott is named after Captain Charles Boycott, who was a land agent in Ireland in 1880, and to fight back after he evicted tenants who struggled to pay their rent due to poor harvests that year, the town basically shunned him and anyone who moved into those tenant spots. So he ended up with no one willing to farm the land, to do business with him, or even deliver his mail. And boycotts have continued to be a pretty popular thing ever since then for so many different reasons, whether it's because of the way a brand treats its employees, or because a brand publicly supports a political or social cause that groups don't agree with, or simply because they've pushed their customers a little bit too far and are being pretty tone deaf about it. A great example of this is, of course, the fact that lately prices have been going up. We've had a lot of inflation, but pay has not matched that. And there's a lot of concern about the fact that the prices are going up with the claims that it's due to COVID or other manufacturing issues, but at the same time, those companies are reporting record profits. So there's a lot of concern that there might be a bit of extra inflation in there. And of course, when companies then go and do something kind of tone deaf, like Kellogg's saying, hey, if you can't afford to buy a whole meal for your family, just eat cereal for dinner. Of course, also being one of the companies that is raising prices a lot. It doesn't go over terribly well, and now there's of course talk about boycotting Kellogg's between the beginning of April and the end of June in order to send a message to them that that really isn't okay. This story is almost exactly like the one that I'm going to be telling today, but it's a far weirder history. It happened in 1920 and it was called the Overall Movement. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, and ended up with thousands of Americans across the country wearing overalls as part of the boycott. So how did we end up there, of all places? Because they weren't actually boycotting the overalls themselves, it was more like a publicity stunt in a way. Well, prices, not surprisingly, had gone up between 1914 and the end of 1918 when the armistice happened. Prices had gone up a significant amount in terms of cost of living. In fact, numbers say anywhere from 60 to 75% of an increase in what people were paying by the end of the war. And this was concerning, but pay had also gone up a fair amount during that same time, pretty comparable in amount. However, the concern was when things were going to start coming back down. So in 1919, after the war had been over for a few months, people started to get concerned about the fact that manufacturers were saying, hey, we're going to start lowering your wages. And if you aren't okay with that, we're going to have to start laying people off because everything's just too expensive for us right now, and we really need to be paying you less. And people said, that's fine if you also lower the cost of living, but if you can't guarantee us that or do that first, then we're not okay with our pay being taken down as well, because then everything's just too expensive for us to afford. Pretty understandable. So there was a lot of discussion happening in 1919 about what needed to occur in order to balance the inflation out. Clothing, for example, had gone up a full 100%. It doubled in price. And of course, while today that may seem like slightly less of a problem, clothing was a far more essential item to them back in 1920. If you look at household spending accounts from the 1920s, they recommend that the top 3 things you spend on are your housing, your food, and your clothing. Today in the US, the average household expenditure on clothing is about 2.5% of your household income. In 1919-1920 range, it was recommended that you have between 15 and 20% of your income allotted to clothing. Now, of course, clothing was more expensive, but it was in general just much more necessary. So a business suit was still necessary for a lot of people to actually do their jobs. The same thing goes with general fashionable day wear and evening wear and things like that. It was just considered much more normalized that you had to have these things in order to participate in society. Even if they weren't necessarily the height of style, they were really essential. But that is honestly a very complex subject, and I'm working on an entire video for that. I'm just needing to develop a whole bunch of spreadsheets in order to understand what I'm looking at, because I'm dealing with a lot of economics and numbers there. It's taking a lot of time and effort. It's fascinating, but it is a lot of effort. And on that note, I am very thankful for this week's sponsor for that reason, because it's allowing me to get a really good night's sleep after all of this work, and that is Birch. A good night's sleep can make all the difference, and with everything I do in a day, I can't just leave that to chance. That's why I am so happy to introduce Birch. They make mattresses and sleep products that are stylish, comfortable, and environmentally conscious. Not only do they offer the simplicity of having a premium mattress delivered to your door, but their mattresses are crafted with organic and natural materials that have been sustainably sourced, and they're free from polyurethane foams and fiberglass, so no off-gassing or irritants. The Birch Luxe Natural Mattress even includes 8 different layers of organic cashmere, New Zealand wool, fair trade cotton, and 100% natural latex. And by having wool in these mattresses instead of synthetics, it makes them both allergen and mildew resistant, which is really important for me as we near spring. I am allergic to pretty much everything outside and a good portion of inside too. So reducing irritants where I'm going to spend a third of my day is absolutely essential. I've been sleeping on my Birch mattress for more than 2 years, and I get to wake up without sniffles and soreness every day. And now the guest room has a bed as comfortable as my own, which this is also my office, so Bailey and I both appreciate the naps in here. And you don't have to worry about trying it out. With your Birch mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. That means you'll get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. The best part about all of this is that Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. They also offer in-home setup and removal to make your buying experience as convenient as possible. I love my Birch mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking to upgrade your sleep, it's the perfect time to check out Birch Living. You can get 20% off of a Birch mattress plus 2 free Eco-Rest pillows by visiting my link, birchliving.com/Nicole Rudolph. Thanks again to Birch for sponsoring this week's video. Now, back to that economic side, the big question became why exactly companies were raising these prices, and they provided quite a few reasons for it. Many of them blamed it on the workers. They said that the unions had forced them to raise the pay, which of course was partially true, but also the fact that they were in the middle of a war, there was difficulty getting workers as well as supplies, so paying people more kind of makes sense. Others blamed the new 44-hour work week, which was not a law just yet, but it was becoming more popular. But they were saying that with 44 hours instead of 48, they were losing so much productivity and the workers weren't making enough stuff, and the companies couldn't keep up with how much needed to be made, and so they were bidding against each other for the goods that were being produced, and then they were also bidding against each other for the workers that were in shortage, which is what seems to be the really popular complaint of a lot of articles that I came across, saying the reason why prices are so high is not the company's fault, it's not the manufacturers, it's the consumer. The consumer in 1919 is just buying too much stuff. They are spending money left and right and not actually being smart about what they're buying. They're overspending and causing problems with supply and demand. They're demanding too many things that we can't supply, and so of course the price is going up. If only they would stop buying, the companies would have to lower the prices. Of course, they also acknowledge that for that to happen, what would actually be the case is as people stop buying as much, the company would start losing money, so they would start laying off workers so that way they could continue to function, and then eventually they would hire those workers back on at a lesser rate once things normalized. They also said that this wasn't nearly as much of a problem in the past when we had large quantities of immigrants coming over and they could pay them next to nothing. So it's just a matter of the fact that people demand too much money and demand too many products, and we just need people to stop spending so much money. Of course, even this giant article that is very extensive on the many reasons why it thinks prices have gone up fails to mention one very important factor. What is the markup on all of these goods? Basically, once the thing is made at cost, how much more does the manufacturer mark it up over that to be sold to the consumer? And this is where the term profiteering comes in. We don't hear it nearly as much anymore. It's sort of an umbrella for different things like price fixing and price gouging. So both of those fall under the umbrella of profiteering, and this was a big concern at the time because they were starting to notice trends of companies potentially raising prices without actually needing to. This again, much like today, leads to companies reporting record profits, along with saying, oh, poor us, we have to pay our workers so much. There was ample evidence of profiteering happening during the war and continuing to happen after. And so they were beginning to look into ways of controlling that. Initially, a lot of calls were saying that the government needs to do something about that, and they sort of did. So in 1917, while we were still in the war, there were concerns over the price of food going up. So the Food Control Act was passed in 1917 1917 to help control the amount of markup that was happening on food and sort of stabilize that market. In 1919, as people were growing concerned over the prices continuing to rise, they added in an amendment to that included clothing. Granted, this act did not last much longer. It wasn't terribly well written or very specific, so by 1921 it had been thrown out by a federal court. Other places, such as Britain in 1919, also put in profiteering acts, but there was a lot of confusion over exactly how these things were going to be enforced, how much they were allowing, what prices should be, how do you keep updating that, how do you regulate that and track it. It was a very complex system that they just weren't prepared to handle. There were a growing number of fair price committees in more local areas, big cities or even states, that did manage to take some more local companies to court over the years. But in 1919, there were still major concerns that what was going on was not enough to fix it, and the prices were going to keep going up. So people started planning on doing boycotts. A lot of these started very small, local cities, and a good number of them started with women's clubs that said, hey, let's figure out what we're purchasing that we shouldn't be, what is overpriced maybe, let's not buy silk stockings, let's not buy the extra things that we don't actually need, and we can also come up with lists of what prices should be and choose to not purchase things that are over that price. So a very low level of boycotting, but when it comes to localized stores and groups, that can have a pretty decent impact. They also were saying that they had concerns over things like false labeling, because a lot of companies were saying something was a certain quality level and charging the appropriate level for that, but then when the thing was actually purchased, they found out that it was far lower quality than it was actually claimed and not labeled accurately. So that is something that eventually the government does kind of step in and help with, but honestly today we still have that same issue, so it's not really been fixed. But as of April of 1920, things had kind of bubbled up to a point where something larger was going to happen, and that's where the overall movement starts. They also sometimes call it the Overalls Club, or the Denim Club, or the Old Clothes Club, or Blue Denim Club, or even the Patch Club. And this forms out of a lot of existing groups. Of course, this is well before we have easy communication around the country, but as different existing men's clubs, women's clubs, schools and universities, workers groups with unions, such as railway workers and things like that, start picking up on this idea and spreading it throughout their groups, it actually moves really fast from starting in the South, moving up to the Northeast and over to California eventually. So it spread out nationally and made its way up to Canada as well. And in general, what they were encouraging is that people stop buying brand new clothing, or at the very least stop buying overpriced clothing. Some of these groups advocated for simply wearing your old clothing, patching it up, repairing it, continuing to wear it till it literally falls apart for as long as you possibly can and not purchasing any new clothing. Others wanted something a little bit more pizzazz to it, and so that's where the overalls came in. Overalls were a pretty popular work garment in the era. They're not always quite what we're familiar with. They can have the bib in front, sometimes they just have suspenders, and sometimes they're just pants. They go on over the other garments that you are wearing, hence overalls, and they are typically worn by workers, though there are fashionable versions for women who are gardening, or people who want to go play cowboy on a ranch, or children for that matter. So overalls are already a little bit on the trendy side in certain ways, but they're very much considered workwear clothing. And so what they were encouraging is people go out and purchase jeans or overalls, or hopefully they already have a pair, and they wear those instead of their regular clothing because they're cheap. And it would put a point to the fact that I'm only going to buy cheap clothing, functional things, until you make the rest of the clothing, like suits and dresses, be more affordable. Of course, that meant that there was sort of a mix of what people were wearing. Gingham and calico were also regularly cited for women's wear, and the whole thing turned into quite a bit of a spectacle. In New York City, there was an entire parade for this that was held by the Cheese Club, which I'm disappointed to tell you does not actually particularly like cheese. At least that's not part of their existence. I don't know why they're called the Cheese Club, but it's nothing to do with cheese. They also managed to get politicians in DC to start wearing overalls into the House and the Senate in order to really rile up attention. Lots of students and universities or going to prom started wearing overalls or denim or old clothes. Some places cracked down on that and said you have to wear certain things to classes, but a lot of these student groups really got very active in the movement. Of course, there were some that didn't quite grasp the point of this, and you end up with stories like that of Billy B. Rose in New York City, who wore denim. He was a very wealthy man, apparently. He just also wore it with an expensive silk shirt and handkerchief and hat, so kind of defeating some of the purpose there. There were also reports of denim tuxedos at theaters, but I can't help but picture the early 2000s with this, so I guess those were not the first denim tuxedos. The problem with all of this is that though it garnered a lot of attention by wearing this crazy stuff, it meant that there was concern over the overpurchasing of an item that was necessary for a lot of working class. So they termed this positive harm and said that by raising the demand, they were raising the prices of overalls and they were beginning to price those out that actually needed them. So a lot of the clubs started shifting more towards the suggestion of wear old clothing, or if you have these things already, wear them. Don't go out and buy new stuff, or at the very least, if you are going to go out and buy overalls, they can't be over this price. If they started to go over this price, don't buy them. They're clearly just price gouging this. So there's a loosening of the expectations. The thing is, all of this is taking place in the matter of really less than 2 weeks. It starts up in early April, and by the time we reach the end of April, there's really not much talk about it. It was a really big flash in the pan moment that apparently included thousands of people all across the country. It was massive, but it didn't last for terribly long. Of course, though, that got all the newspapers talking about it. It had everyone aware of it. And it did provide, therefore, some impact. There were companies that pretty immediately started marking down the price of their clothing, putting things on sale, but by the fact that they're really heavily advertising this, I think it is more of a sales tactic than an actual result of, because it's happening within the first few days of the movement. So obviously no one's feeling the pinch just yet. If anything, they're seeing more sales because people are going and buying denim right now. So they actually talk about the fact that more and more stores are putting up denim and gingham and calico in their windows. So that way everyone knows they can come buy those things here. So it might not actually have had the initial impact that they were looking for. However, the idea of the overall movement spread not only around the country, but it also spread internationally in the coming months and years. Paris had their own overall movement just a few months later in June, and it raised awareness of this on a more communal level. It also meant that there were more companies that were being reported for profiteering. So there were an increasing number of indictments against companies who were supposedly marking things up around 110% or even more. It was considered normal to mark up clothing around 20 to 40% over the manufacturing costs. But 110% and up, that was when they would start going after them for profiteering. Some were as high as 200%. Now, I want to give you some reference for this in the fact that today it's considered bare minimum to do a markup of around 50%. And that is for bargain basement prices. More typically, the things you're purchasing that aren't on major sale are going to be marked up anywhere from 100 to 400%. Commonly. This is not even for the really expensive stuff. And this is partly due to our current manufacturing system where usually you have the manufacturers, you have the designers, and then they actually sell it to the retailers and everyone else is taking their cut along the way, as well as all of the modern advertisements and the global shipping and websites and storefronts and so many things that cost money. But also, there's definitely a good chunk of that markup that is just going straight to the upper parts of the company. So in terms of markup, where we are today is dramatically more than they were historically back then. As for the long-term effect of the overall movement, if you go and look up a lot of the modern articles on it, they'll say that it was completely unsuccessful and actually achieved absolutely nothing. But the reality is it's really hard to tell. It definitely had an awareness going. It definitely helped people understand what costs were actually reasonable for clothing and what wasn't, understanding that this was a national problem and not just a local one. This is, of course, well before we have the communication of the social media that we do now, so people just wouldn't have necessarily known how much of an issue it was or how to do anything about it. So it definitely helped in some ways, but it's really hard to track if it actually had a financial impact, purely because that time period was going up and down constantly in terms of economy. So 1919 was up, 1920 was down, 1921 was up again. It just kept going back and forth for a good number of years before we hit the Great Depression in 1929. So things were kind of volatile, and it's really difficult to know what actually was affected, because prices did start to drop by the end of 1920. There were reports of reductions of 20 to 25% in clothing by the end of the year. By the middle of 1921, it was closer to 30-35%, and in general, the cost of living had come down around 18% by that point. So we're seeing reductions. How much the overall movement directly impacted that or even indirectly impacted. That is very difficult to say. Overall though, it's a great example of how they managed to work together large boycotts and large movements like this, strikes or whatever it may be, and actually reach attention on a global scale. Of course, we're still dealing with these sorts of problems today, so the laws and the regulations that they had put into place over the years during wartime haven't really made that much of a difference. There are regulations on state levels that prevent price gouging during emergencies, such as COVID, and that did go into effect during some of those years. However, that only applies during that emergency, and usually it's only restricting how much it can go up every year. So it might say no more than 10% price raising. That has nothing to do with what it means on a long-term basis, where they can continue to raise it 10% every single year regardless. So we don't really have regulations in place to deal with any of that. There are some things on monopolies or other types of price fixing where they're artificially inflating the price as different companies get together or sort of massed into one conglomeration, but that honestly isn't terribly effective because there are so many companies that keep doing it. At the very least, it's certainly not being enforced. Just simply going and looking at what's available in your local grocery store, a lot of the goods there are owned by a very small number of companies. If you do want to participate in boycotts and things of the like, there's also some links down below to talk about what companies are supporting what things. So go check those out down below if that's something that sounds of interest to you. It's just interesting to me that this is an ongoing idea and has been for so long. And the way that they were boycotting in 1920, for all of its success and all of its failures, is a great lesson in perhaps how we can do so better today.